And it should be noted, it's when we won a lot of important reforms, right? You see memes on social media all the time saying thank a union for this, that, and another thing, but it was thank a socialist, right? 8-hour workday. I just read my 8-month-old son a story today about Mother Jones and her March of the Mill Children, right? Like it was socialists that won child labor protections, that won, all, workplace safety stuff, all that kind of stuff. So not only were they electing people, but they're passing and getting through very important, protections that remain today and that are valued still today.
Yeah, it was a strong combination of, getting in the streets with activism, with supporting labor unions, and, with getting people elected. And that combination really created a lot of change. And when people have that rose-colored look at American history and, oh, I wish it was like that again, most of what they're thinking of was gains by socialists that were fighting, particularly during this era. And so, of course, because of that, there were difficulties. So Debs himself was actually jailed at one point for speaking out against imperialism, for speaking out against war. And he actually ran for president from jail for a while. The Republican and Democratic parties worked to suppress the Socialist Party and make it harder for independent parties to form in the future. And so that's something, of course, we have to look at and think about, that as we're creating a new Green Party for the mass working class, what are those hurdles that we're looking at in order to overcome, right? We also saw that a lot of the radical unions that were fighting at the time, that this is when a lot of the modern police forces were created. For example, the state police in Pennsylvania were created during that time period, and they weren't created because there was like a giant crime spree or whatever. They were literally created to suppress worker strikes, and their tactics were taken directly out of military occupation tactics. So, that's an important part of history for us to understand, when we're talking about issues around policing and stuff, that it partly because of racism and, slavery and things, and also partly to suppress socialist and labor unions and things. And then finally, because the Socialist Party was so successful, it had, of course, its own platform and demands and its own vision that it wanted to implement. And capitalism was so threatened by it that FDR essentially stole a lot of those points and watered them down, and said, in order to kind of address the things, but in a way that was going to save capitalism. And that was what became the New Deal. So capitalism was able to co-opt the Socialist Party message, essentially. So I think these are all important things that we should keep in mind as we're organizing. That capitalism. Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
This period too is also when you saw lots of unions begin to emulate capitalism and change significantly. World War II was a big, bellwether point for the direction that, or World War I was a big bellwether point for where unions were moving as the union. When we were winning these things in the 1800s and the early 1900s, unions were small and radical organizations, but they kept combining into these larger and larger and larger organizations until you get to the point in World War I where unions became a pretty big player in suppressing anti-war sentiments in the left, because and it's the same kind of stuff you hear now, right? The AFL-CIO always backs to pipelines because that means jobs, right? And this is the same era when you see, the AFL and CIO and things like that start to form. And so you start to get these bureaucratic centralized unions coming up that their mission is no longer to wage war with capital like the original and the successful smaller radical unions were. So, we'd always talked about systems and things. So this capitalist backlash managed to infect the working class leadership and really start us down a road of misleadership and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's especially what kind of the last point on this slide really hits on, that the so-called New Deal coalition, what that really was the Democratic Party co-opting independent political parties as well as those originally very radical labor unions. In our slide earlier, we talked about, a lot of the Marxists wanted these independent worker parties, and those parties were co-opted into the Democratic Party during this era, essentially because the Democratic Party said, "Hey, we'll do a little bit of what you want, and maybe if you work with us, you'll get a little bit more," and a little bit of a combination of the carrot and the stick, right? That it's hard to go it alone, and maybe if you work with capitalism, you'll get some crumbs. And then in addition to that, the labor unions, syndicalists and things like that originally started with very radical viewpoints of taking workplaces for the workers, eventually became co-opted and meshed into the Democratic Party because, again, that was kind of an easier path of resistance. So it seems like they're doing some stuff from workers, and we'll just kind of go that path and see if it works a little bit better. So we saw these radical movements get co-opted into the Democratic Party around this time period, and many of them are still co-opted there. We have a history of
what's still a tried and true tactic for them.
So, yeah, for 80 years now, right? Something like that. For 80 years, a lot of these labor unions and quasi pseudo independent political parties work within the Democratic Party umbrella, and they get co-opted to make the Democratic Party seem a lot more radical and on the side of workers than it actually is. It really is part of the capitalist, again, the infrastructure of capitalism. It's not individuals in the Democratic Party. It's now baked into capitalism itself.